The weirdest match of this season so far ended 2-1 to Spurs late in the match. And yes, I will be giving my take on the decisions at the end of the video. But I want to focus on how Klopp showed elite game management, both when down to 10 and then down to 9, proving why he's one of the best around. And to understand how Klopp adapted, we must start with Spurs on the ball when it was 11 versus 11. When Spurs were on the attack, as we've seen throughout the season, they built up with two dedicated centre-backs, and for the most part, especially early on, Basuma was the single pivot, flanked by Udogie and Sarr, who would drop deeper, and this would allow Maddison and Porro to push higher up the pitch, so that Spurs had their preferred midfield five. But we know how big an element fluidity is for Ange Postecoglou, so the players would situationally switch into a double pivot when the situation required, or just rotate positions, particularly with Maddison dropping deeper and Udogie pushing higher up the pitch, and Sarr dropping out towards the right from time to time. Liverpool were aware of how much Spurs like to overload the centre of the pitch with this midfield five, as well as Son dropping in from time to time, so they looked to cut this off as quickly as they could, and their front six would defend extremely narrow, with Salah and Diaz coming in quite narrow to help support this play. And when the centre-backs were on the ball, particularly if they split when Vicario was playing higher, the wingers could then press the centre-backs from out to in, again looking to filter the play through the centre of the pitch, where they had this pressing trap set. And when it was 11 versus 11, we would see this pressing trap come into effect time and again, as when Spurs' deeper men in the midfield, whether a single pivot in Basuma or a double pivot got onto the ball, Szoboszlai and Jones were tasked with pressing high and aggressively, with Szoboszlai looking to push onto Basuma in particular. But for the most part, as we know, Basuma's quite press resistant and was able to deal with this. This, however, also created problems for Liverpool, because the space vacated by Szoboszlai could be taken advantage of, particularly by Maddison or Udogie if he was pushing higher up the pitch. This would be either through a pass into the midfield, then finding the man in the half space, or even going backwards and then finding the man in that space vacated by Szoboszlai, allowing Spurs to then turn and push higher up the pitch. When it was 11 versus 11, the positioning of Gomez versus Richarlison was something that could lead to problems. This is because he tended to move wide quite early to look to be touch tight. So if Richarlison did get onto the ball, Gomez would easily be drawn. And we saw Udogie looking to make these half-space runs time and again, meaning that Matip would be dragged out of position to look to cover. That is, if Szoboszlai was still high up the pitch and hadn't had time to make the recovering run, which he managed to do quite effectively early on in the game. But we also saw Maddison taking advantage of situations like this for the goal, as well as a disallowed goal. As if Gomez's body positioning was poor, being so wide so early meant that there was a sizable gap for Richarlison to attack with a simple out to in run that Maddison could then find with the through ball, allowing the goal and the disallowed goal. Whilst it was still 11 versus 11, Liverpool were looking dangerous in the attack as well. And this was partly because Spurs defended in more of a dedicated 4-1-4-1, or at times would even see Maddison or one of the wingers joining into the press. But essentially what this meant is that Basuma had a lot of ground to cover behind the midfield if Liverpool did penetrate. The right-hand side was where Liverpool looked to take advantage of this in particular, as we would see Gomez invert and Szoboszlai move into more of a half-space position, and this would draw Udogie much narrower. This then created problems, as when Salah received, he could be 1 versus 1 against Udogie and look to take on his man, but for the most part he was well supported by Szoboszlai, who tirelessly made these half-space runs and got into dangerous positions for the cross, as it was difficult for Basuma to cover this entire room behind the midfield, as well as track the runs of Szoboszlai. Of course, the Jones sending off was the first turning point. With Jones now off, Liverpool's defensive structure changed completely, as it was now Salah who was the centre forward, whilst Gakpo moved over to right wing, allowing Liverpool to be in a flat 4-4-1. the priority once again for Liverpool was to protect the centre from that overload that Spurs love. And now with a man less, that was done by defending so narrowly that it became more of a 4 in the centre of the midfield. And they were now slightly more passive, where before they were looking to set that pressing trap. Spurs still had some success at times, because the beauty of their midfield shape is that it allows men in front of Liverpool's midfield as well as between the lines. So, whenever somebody was forced to jump in order to press Basuma or one of the deeper midfielders, that created temporary space between the lines where a man could then be found. We particularly saw Maddison do this successfully, as he would drop in deep to draw a midfielder towards him and then find Porro in the half space to look to combine with men higher up. But even down to 10 men, Liverpool were looking extremely dangerous, particularly on the transition. And that was achieved by having Salah as the centre forward because he provided threats in 2 ways. Firstly, he's more than quick enough to himself be found directly running behind the fullbacks, because Porro and Udogie, as we know, are so vital in the attack, they leave the centre-backs somewhat exposed. Salah also has incredible strength, meaning that he could drop in as a false 9, holding off a man if needed. And whenever the ball went up to Salah, knowing that he would be successful in holding up the ball, Diaz and Gakpo, later replaced by Jota, could be comfortable attacking those spaces behind the fullbacks aggressively in order to get in behind, which we saw time and again. But then Jota was sent off as well, and it looked like an absolute disaster for Liverpool for a moment. But Klopp once again adapted brilliantly. With only 9 men, attacking was no longer a possibility, so Salah went off the pitch, and we saw Liverpool switch to a back 5, meaning that they now defended in a 5-3-0. So as we discussed, Spurs' shape gives them numbers in front of the midfield and between the lines, but now with no attacking ambitions, Liverpool could fully sit deep with their midfield and be content for Spurs to have the ball in front of their own midfield, as long as they protected the centre once again and made it impossible to find these men between the lines. This was also backed up by that back 5 shape, as it meant that even if the ball did squeeze in, an extra centre-back could push up instantly so that the man between the lines couldn't turn, knowing that they had 2 more centre-backs covering across. To make it even harder to play through this central block, Liverpool, even with their 5, defended extremely narrow, meaning that the only way Spurs could hope to make progress was going around. But that was also made extremely difficult, because this midfield 3 was an extremely hard-working midfield 3, also backed up by Gravenberch when he came on. So what it meant is that even when the ball did go wide, they would quickly come across to cover either side of the pitch, once again make it impossible for Spurs to penetrate them. And this is where the personnel problems began to pile up for Spurs. This is firstly because when they couldn't penetrate through the centre, it led to a lot of 1v1 situations. However, at least in this match, none of the wide men had that magic to get past their man and then cause an overload in the box as they had taken a man out of the game. This was not helped by Spurs rigidly sticking to their system, meaning that we rarely saw anybody looking to overlap the winger, instead staying with the principle of creating isolations for the 1v1, which wasn't helpful when their wingers weren't getting past their men. This wasn't helped by the fact that when they did look to swing crosses in, they often only had Richarlison to aim for when Son went off. And although he's decent in the air against 3 centre-backs, that's not ideal. And once again, this isn't helped by the personnel, as having Porro high up the pitch and the likes of Udogie, Sarr and Maddison means that they're unlikely to crowd the box to look to win that second ball or even the header. The other problem was that Liverpool could be quite content to give Spurs space outside of the box, because James Maddison is a creative threat as well as a long-range shooting threat. But aside from him, the rest of the attacking players prefer to rotate the ball and aren't as much of a shooting threat, again lacking that X factor in order to break the deep block when it is necessary. Okay, let's get into the decisions, and we'll get the easiest one out of the way first, the Diaz offside. The PGMOL have already announced that this was an error, and the goal should have 100% stood as Diaz was nowhere near offside. Now the 2 more contentious ones, starting with the Curtis Jones one. In my opinion, this is one that I could see going either way. I could see how some would say it's not a red card, as well as why many would say it is a red, due to the high studs and the high contact point on Basuma's leg. Personally, I wouldn't have given a red card just because Curtis Jones's foot clearly slips over the top of the ball. But I can still see why the ref gave it, so it only gets a 5 out of 10 on the bad decision scale. Now the Jota decision, which is another contentious one, and this one I don't see as that bad of a decision. But please give me your opinions on all 3 decisions. For the manager tactical scores, a match with so much interference is hard to judge, but I was unimpressed with Spurs, both when they're playing against 10 and 9, meaning Ange only earns a 5. Liverpool, on the other hand, looked decent at 11 and good at 9 and 10, showing remarkable heart and tactical acumen to limit Spurs to barely any chances, meaning Klopp earns an 8.5. But drop your ratings down below.